The hospital smell hit me before I even opened my eyes. That sharp mix of antiseptic and recycled air that somehow manages to be both sterile and suffocating at the same time. My mouth was dry. The back of my head throbbed against what I could tell was a very flat, very institutional pillow. And for exactly 3 seconds, I had no idea where I was or how I got there. Then it all came back. I'd been standing at the kitchen sink, washing the last of the dinner dishes when I felt it. Not pain exactly, more like a tide going out. Everything in me pulling backward at once. I grabbed the edge of the counter, missed. And then there was nothing. The nurse who came in when I pressed the call button told me I'd been brought in by ambulance around 9:30 the previous evening. A neighbor had heard something fall and knocked on the door. When no one answered, she'd called 911. My blood pressure had dropped dangerously low, the nurse explained in that careful, measured tone medical people use when they're trying not to alarm you. Dehydration. Exhaustion. And she paused, checking something on her tablet. I was 6 weeks pregnant. I lay there staring at the water stain on the ceiling tile directly above my bed for a long time after she left. 6 weeks. I knew what that meant. I'd taken the test 3 weeks earlier, alone in the bathroom of our house in Naperville, a Tuesday morning in November, when the kids across the street were waiting for the school bus, and everything outside looked ordinary and golden and like a life I was supposed to be grateful for. I'd sat on the edge of the tub and stared at those 2 lines and felt something I couldn't name. Not joy exactly, not fear exactly. Something in between that I'd been carrying around ever since, waiting for the right moment to tell my husband. His name is Joel, and Joel, as of 11 days ago, had not come home. We'd been married for 7 years. I was 34. Joel was 38, a regional sales director for a medical device company, which meant he traveled a lot, and I had learned early in our marriage to be comfortable with absence. I worked part-time as a school librarian at the elementary school 2 miles from our house. I drove a sensible car. I made dinner most nights. I knew our neighbors' names and their dogs' names and what time the mail usually came. It was, from the outside, a perfectly ordinary life. The kind you don't question until you find a hotel receipt in the pocket of a blazer you're taking to the dry cleaner. I'd almost missed it. The blazer was navy, and I'd checked the pockets the way I always did. Keys, lip balm, the occasional gas station receipt, before zipping it into the plastic garment bag. The folded paper was small, tucked deep into the interior breast pocket. The Marriott in downtown Indianapolis, 2 nights, a king suite. The weekend of October 14th. The weekend Joel had told me he was at a sales conference in Cincinnati. I stood in the laundry room for a long time, holding that receipt. The dryer was running. I could hear it. The normalcy of it, that domestic hum underneath the absolute implosion happening in my chest, was almost funny. I put the receipt in my jeans pocket. I zipped up the blazer. I drove it to the dry cleaner. I came home, made lunch, and waited. That night, Joel came downstairs after his shower and poured himself a glass of bourbon and sat on the couch with his phone, the way he did most evenings. I was in the armchair across from him, my book open in my lap, not reading a single word. I watched him scroll. I watched his face. At one point, he smiled at something on the screen, a small private smile, and I felt the receipt in my pocket like a coal. "How was your day?" he asked without looking up. "Fine," I said. "Mine too." He took a sip of bourbon. "Long but fine." I nodded. I didn't say anything about the receipt that night, or the next night. Instead, I did something I'm not particularly proud of, but I think anyone who's ever stood in that laundry room moment would understand. I started paying attention. I checked the cellular data on our shared phone plan. I started noting when his location sharing, something we'd set up years ago for convenience, seemed inconsistent with where he said he was. I noticed that he'd started taking his phone into the bathroom, that he'd angled his laptop screen away from me, that he'd begun working late at least twice a week, calling from his office number so I couldn't see exactly where he was. Her name, I found out eventually, was Amber. She was 29. She worked in his company's marketing department. I found her Instagram through a mutual connection, a company holiday party photo from 2 years ago where she was standing close enough to Joel that their arms were touching. She was pretty in the way that made me feel both petty for noticing and devastated that I'd noticed. Long dark hair, a big warm smile, the kind of person who looked genuinely happy in photographs. I wondered how long it had been going on. I wondered if she knew about me. I wondered a lot of things in those weeks while I carried both the receipt and the pregnancy test and said nothing. Watching my husband eat dinner across from me and help load the dishwasher and kiss me on the cheek before bed. Like everything was exactly as it should be. The breaking point came on a Thursday. I'd asked Joel, carefully, casually, if he wanted to go up to my parents' cabin in Wisconsin the weekend after Thanksgiving. Just the two of us. I thought, in whatever part of me was still hoping, that maybe if we had time alone, away from routines, I could find a way to tell him about the baby. A way to make us real again. He said he had to work that weekend. A client thing. He was sorry. I said okay, and then I opened our joint bank account that night while he was in the garage, and I found a charge on the debit card. 2 round-trip flights to Charleston. Booked for the weekend after Thanksgiving. His name and one other. I didn't sleep at all that night. In the morning, while Joel was in the shower and I was standing in the kitchen making coffee I didn't want, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront him in our kitchen over coffee. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to give him the opportunity to talk his way around it or make me feel like I was overreacting or ask me how I'd found out like that was the real problem. I was going to see a lawyer first. Her name was Patricia. No, wait. I need to be careful here. Her name was Diane. Diane Kowalski, a family law attorney with an office on Washington Street in downtown Naperville. She had a firm handshake and a wall full of diplomas, and the kind of calm, steady manner that made you feel like your situation, however catastrophic it felt from the inside, was utterly manageable from where she was sitting. She explained what I needed to know. Illinois is an equitable distribution state, meaning marital assets are divided fairly, though not necessarily 50-50. Fault, like infidelity, can be considered by the court, particularly when it's been accompanied by dissipation of marital assets. That's the legal term for when a spouse spends marital money on an affair. Hotels, flights, gifts, all of it documented, all of it potentially factoring into how the assets get split. I sat across from Diane's desk and felt something settle in me. Not peace, exactly. More like the particular steadiness that comes when the ground stops moving. Start documenting everything, she told me. Bank statements, credit card records, anything that shows where the money went and when. I had already started. I went home and I made dinner and I waited 3 more days. Then, on a Sunday evening in late November, when Joel came downstairs dressed in a blazer I didn't recognize. New dark charcoal, still with that barely worn stiffness, and told me he had to fly to Minneapolis for an emergency client meeting. First thing Monday morning, I looked at him across our kitchen island and I said, "I know about Amber." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I've ever heard in my life. Joel set his phone face down on the counter. He looked at me. Something moved across his face that I couldn't read. It went too fast, through too many things, and then settled into something that looked almost like relief, which was somehow worse than anything else he could have shown me. "Grace," he said. "Don't," I said. "Just don't." He tried anyway. He said it wasn't what I thought. He said it had been a mistake. He said it was over. He said he loved me. He said he was sorry. He said a lot of things, and I stood on the other side of the kitchen island and listened to all of them, and when he was done, I told him that I had already spoken to an attorney. He went very still. "I'm not doing this tonight," I said. "Or this week. But I need you to understand that I know, and I have documentation, and I am not going to pretend I don't." Joel slept in the guest room that night. This next morning he left for the airport before I was up. He texted me from the gate. "We need to talk when I'm back. Please." I read it and put my phone in my bag and went to work. He came home Wednesday. We talked. Or he talked, mostly. He cried, which I hadn't expected, and I found that I felt very little watching it, which frightened me more than the crying did. He said he'd ended things with Amber. He said he wanted to fix our marriage. He said he'd do whatever it took. I said I needed time to think. What I didn't say still was that I was pregnant. I hadn't told anyone. Not my mother, not my best friend Lena, who had been calling me every other day with a kind of worried frequency that told me she could sense something was wrong, even across the 400 miles between my house and hers in Columbus. I kept finding reasons to push the conversation off. I didn't know how to say it yet. I wasn't sure what I was going to do. Then the dizziness started. Small at first. A head rush when I stood up too fast. A few mornings where the smell of coffee, which I'd loved my entire adult life, made my stomach turn. I started eating crackers before I got out of bed. I started going to sleep by 9. I told myself it was stress. The night I fainted, Joel was in Dallas. I'd called him that afternoon about something ordinary, a bill that had come in the mail. And he'd answered distracted, half present, the way he'd been since our conversation. And we'd spoken for 4 minutes and said nothing of consequence. And after I hung up, I stood in the kitchen feeling more alone than I had in years. I don't remember falling. I remember the edge of the counter. I remember the linoleum floor coming up very fast. The neighbor who found me was a woman named Beverly, who lived 2 doors down and had apparently heard what she described to the paramedics as a very loud crash. She was 71 years old and had the good sense to call 911 immediately, and I owe her more than I know how to express. When the EMTs arrived, my phone, which I'd been carrying in my apron pocket, was dead, completely out of battery. Beverly gave them her own phone to contact my emergency contact, which was Lena, who called my mother, who called Joel. It took Joel 11 hours to come home. Lena, who drove from Columbus the moment she got the call, arrived at the hospital before he did. She sat beside my bed with her coat still on, holding my hand and not saying anything for a while, which is one of the things I love most about her. She didn't ask questions I didn't have answers to. She just stayed. My mother called in the early morning, her voice doing that careful, measured thing where you can hear the panic underneath the calm, and I told her I was all right. I told her about the baby. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Oh, sweetheart," and I started crying, which I hadn't done yet. Joel arrived at the hospital at 11:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was watching the clock on the wall when he walked in, the way you watch things when you've been awake too long, and your mind has run out of things to do. He stood in the doorway of my room for a moment before coming in. He looked tired. He was still in the clothes he'd traveled in. "I got here as fast as I could," he said. I nodded. He sat in the chair beside the bed, the chair where Lena had been sitting before she'd stepped out for coffee, and he looked at me with something that might have been remorse and might have been fear and was probably some mixture of both, and he said, "The nurse told me about the baby." "Yes," I said. "Why didn't you tell me?" I looked at him. I thought about the hotel receipt in the blazer pocket. I thought about the flights to Charleston. I thought about the 4-minute phone call from the kitchen floor. I thought about 11 hours. I wasn't sure yet what I was going to do. I said, "I'm still not." He reached for my hand and I let him take it, because I was too tired to pull away and because some part of me, the part that had loved him for 10 years, still responded to the warmth of his hand in mine like a reflex. But I watched his face while he sat there, and I noticed that he didn't ask me how I felt. He didn't ask what the doctor had said, or what the baby's heartbeat was, or whether I'd eaten anything. He asked me twice about what our lawyer situation looked like, and he asked me once, quietly, whether I'd told anyone about Amber. I looked at him for a long moment. "You should probably go get something to eat," I said. "You look exhausted." He did not fight for our marriage the way he said he would. I want to be clear about that, because in the weeks and months that followed, there was a version of the story Joel told people, mutual friends, his mother, his brother, where he had tried, desperately, to save things, and I had been too hurt and too proud to let him. I know this because people told me, not unkindly, in the way that people pass along information they think you already know. What actually happened was simpler and sadder. He moved out in January, into a 2-bedroom apartment in the city. He cited needing space to figure things out. The space seemed to involve Amber, whose Instagram I had quietly stopped following because some information just stops being useful after a certain point. He paid child support without argument, which his attorney probably told him to do. He was present, in a logistical sense, for the pregnancy. He came to one ultrasound, the anatomy scan at 20 weeks, and stood beside me in that dim room, watching the screen with an expression I couldn't read. We drove separately. We drove home separately. The divorce proceedings took 8 months. Diane was thorough and specific, and the documentation I'd gathered, bank records, credit card statements, the hotel receipt I'd carried in my jeans pocket for weeks, painted a very clear picture for the court. The marital asset dissipation claim held. We'd built a lot together in 7 years: the house, retirement accounts, savings. The final settlement was not 50-50. I didn't feel triumphant when it was done. I want to say that clearly, because I think people expect you to feel victorious when the legal outcome is in your favor. And what I actually felt, sitting in Diane's office signing the last of the paperwork, was something closer to grief. The uncomplicated kind. The kind that just means something is over. My daughter was born in June, on a Tuesday afternoon when the hospital windows were bright with summer light. I named her Rose. Lena was in the room. My mother was in the waiting area, wearing the floor of the linoleum between the vending machines and the elevator, by her own account. My father had driven up from Peoria, and was sitting next to my mother, patting her hand at intervals. Joel was not there. He had offered to be, and I had told him, gently, that I didn't think that was what I needed. And he had accepted that without protest, in a way that told me it was something of a relief for him too. Rose weighed 7 pounds, 2 ounces. She had very dark hair, which the nurse said might change, and she looked at me in that first hour with an expression of profound suspicion that I found completely understandable given the circumstances. I held her and I thought, okay, we're going to be okay. The first time I met Tom was at Lena's 4th of July party, 3 weeks after Rose came home from the hospital. I almost didn't go. I was running on approximately 4 hours of broken sleep. I fit into approximately none of my clothes, and the idea of making conversation with people I didn't know held approximately zero appeal. But Lena, who had been driving down from Columbus every other weekend since January and had established herself as a person whose opinions I trusted entirely, told me that I needed to leave my house, and that she would watch Rose for 2 hours while I did it, and that I would thank her later. She was not wrong. Tom was a high school history teacher. 39. He had been Lena's husband's college roommate, which was the kind of connection that sounds unremarkable until you're standing on someone's back deck in the late afternoon light, talking to a person you've just met about the particular difficulty of explaining the Reconstruction era to 16-year-olds, and you realize you've been talking for 40 minutes and the ice in your drink has melted. He knew I had a baby. Lena had mentioned it. She told me later, not to set the stage, but because she thought anyone worth my time ought to know the relevant facts up front. He asked about Rose in a way that wasn't performative, not the slightly too enthusiastic, "Oh, that's amazing," of someone being carefully supportive, but genuinely curious. How old? What's she like? Is she sleeping at all? Not really, I said. My sister's kid didn't sleep through the night until 14 months, he said. She survived. So did the kid. I laughed, an actual laugh, not a polite one, which surprised me. We talked until Lena came looking for me because Rose was awake, and apparently making her opinion about the situation very clearly known. Tom asked for my number before I left. I gave it to him. I drove home thinking, I am not ready for this. I am absolutely not ready for this. But Lena, watching me from the front door as I buckled Rose into the car seat, was smiling in a way that said she disagreed. He texted that night. Just, really nice to meet you. Hope the non-sleeping goes well. I read it in the dark of Rose's room at 2 in the morning while she finally, mercifully, settled. I smiled at my phone like a person who was apparently, in spite of everything, not entirely done with the world. We had coffee the following Saturday. We walked in Centennial Park while Rose slept in the stroller, and Tom matched his pace to mine without comment, the way people do when they're paying attention to someone other than themselves. He told me about growing up in Michigan, about his students, about the year he'd spent teaching abroad in Prague after college, which was not what I'd expected from a man who coached JV basketball and drove a Ford pickup. You're more interesting than you look, I told him, which is maybe not the smoothest thing I've ever said to another person. He grinned. I'll take it. I did not fall in love with Tom quickly. I want to be honest about that. It was slow, and sometimes I resisted it, and there were nights when Rose was finally asleep and the house was quiet, and I lay in the dark thinking about the 7 years I'd spent building something with someone who hadn't wanted to keep it. The grief came in waves for a long time. It still does, sometimes. That's just the truth of it. But Tom was patient in a way I hadn't known to look for. He didn't push. He showed up. He drove 2 hours to help me move a piece of furniture when my lease started in September. And he stayed for dinner and did the dishes and left at 9 o'clock without being asked, because he was paying attention to the lines I needed him to see. He met Rose when she was 4 months old. He sat on the floor of my living room and made faces at her until she smiled, which was new and still miraculous to me. And I watched from the couch, thinking something I couldn't fully name yet. Something that felt, carefully, like beginning. I heard about Joel and Amber's breakup from his mother. Her name was Beverly. No, I've used that name already for my neighbor. Her name was Gail. Gail called me on a Wednesday in October, 9 months after the divorce was finalized, which was unusual because Gail and I had spoken maybe 4 times since January. Always about Rose, always logistically. She asked about Rose first. Then there was a pause, and then she said, in the careful way of someone who has rehearsed the conversation, I owe you an apology. I sat down. Gail had known. Not everything, not the full timeline, but she had suspected something was wrong with her son's marriage for over a year. had seen things at family gatherings that hadn't added up, had heard phone calls she shouldn't have heard. She'd told herself it wasn't her place. She'd told herself she didn't know for certain. I should have called you, she said. I've thought about it every day since. I didn't know what to say to that. I still don't, entirely. I told her I appreciated her calling. I told her it wasn't her responsibility. I don't know if either of those things was completely true, but they were the things I could say honestly in that moment. She told me before we hung up that Amber had ended things with Joel's in September, that he was living alone in the apartment and, by her account, not doing particularly well. She wasn't telling me to make me feel anything specific, she said. She just thought I should know. After I hung up, I sat for a long time at my kitchen table. Rose was in her bouncy chair on the floor, watching me with that dark-eyed seriousness she'd had since birth. I reached down and touched her foot, and she flexed her toes around my finger. I thought about Joel in that apartment. I thought about the particular silence of a space where the person who should be there isn't. I knew something about that silence. I'd lived in it for a long time. I didn't feel glad. I want to be honest about that too. I had thought, in the early days, that I would feel glad when the scales balanced. When Joel experienced even a fraction of what he'd put me through. What I actually felt, sitting at my kitchen table on that Wednesday in October, was something quieter and less satisfying, and more honest. I felt tired. I felt like something that had been tightly wound in my chest for over a year was finally, slowly, loosening. And then Rose made a sound. A small, demanding, completely self-assured sound. And I laughed and picked her up, and she grabbed a fistful of my hair and held on. And that was enough. That was more than enough. Tom proposed on a Tuesday in March. Not with a grand gesture, not at a restaurant, or with a flash mob, or anything that required a plan filed with multiple parties weeks in advance. We were in my kitchen. His kitchen by then, in practice if not on paper, making breakfast on a Sunday morning. And Rose was in her high chair eating small pieces of banana with intense concentration. And Tom handed me a cup of coffee, and then stood there with an expression I didn't recognize immediately. And then he said, I want to do this with you, the whole thing. If you want that too. He had the ring in his jacket pocket. He'd been carrying it, he told me later, for 3 weeks, waiting for a moment that felt like us. Not a performance. Just us, in the morning, with coffee and a baby, and no particular audience. I said yes. Lena cried when I called her. My mother said finally, with a feeling that suggested she'd been waiting with some impatience. My father was quiet for a moment and then said, He's a good man, Grace. I can see that. Joel was informed because Rose needed both her parents to know things that would affect her life. He received the news via text, which wasn't ideal, but was appropriate given everything. He replied, Congratulations. I hope you're happy. Diane, who I'd spoken to briefly when updating some custody documentation, told me later that he'd called her office with a procedural question and had seemed, in her professional assessment, very quiet. I thought about Gail's phone call. I thought about the apartment. I thought about a man sitting alone somewhere in the city with a version of the future he'd burned down himself, and then I thought, that's not mine to carry anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. We got married the following September, on a Saturday when the leaves in the park had just started to turn, and the light had that particular quality it gets in early fall. Honey warm, and a little melancholy, and absolutely beautiful. Rose, 14 months old by then, and walking with the confident, lunging gait of someone who has only recently discovered her own feet, wore a small dress with a sash, and spent most of the ceremony trying to eat a flower she'd pulled from the arrangement nearest to her. Tom's college roommates sat in the front row and cried, which Tom claimed was embarrassing and was clearly not embarrassed by at all. Lena was my maid of honor. She gave a toast that made everyone laugh and then made everyone cry, in the best possible order. My mother danced. My father watched my mother dance with the expression of a man who has been watching her for 40 years and still finds her remarkable. Which is the kind of marriage I had stopped believing in for a while and had started believing in again. I stood in that September light next to Tom, and I thought about everything it had taken to get to that specific moment. The laundry room, the receipt, the floor of my kitchen coming up fast, the hospital room at 11:47 in the morning, the park with the melted ice, the Tuesday morning with the coffee and the ring in the jacket pocket. I thought, none of it was wasted, not even the worst of it. Tom looked at me the way he always does, like he's paying attention, like he actually sees me, and he smiled, and I smiled back, and somewhere behind us Rose made her opinion about the proceedings known in a voice that carried across the entire venue, And everyone laughed. And we were married. The past was done. We were already living in what came next.